we are delighted to have the Reverend Dr. Timothy Everhart with us today from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Tim is married to Becky Everhart, who is a vice president at the seminary, and she is back there. Would you stand or wave at us? Thank you for coming. And Tim has 3 children. He has a young guy in high school, starting high school. He has another one in middle school. And he has a daughter in elementary school, and she must be hiding, but she is here. Audrey, Audrey, come wave at us. Come wave. Let us see you, Audrey. Hi. All right, that's Miss Audrey. Be sure to speak to her. And I was given a big compliment. Someone asked me if that was my daughter. I wish. Tim went to St. Olaf. And he and I will have to talk. Our son went to Carleton, and when we went to graduation, had to pay a book fine at St. Olaf so he could graduate, and discovered the draw at St. Olaf were the girls, the women there. Yeah, there you are. He did his MDiv and his PhD at Vanderbilt University, which is where he and Katie connected up together. Met each other. Those signs. Met each other together. And he has been at Garrett for how many years? 7 years. That's very biblical. We're happy you're here. And he has a brand new book, which I meant to bring up here. The title is
Rooted and Grounded in Love.
Rooted and Grounded in Love, and it's available back there on the table, and you can purchase one brand new out. You really ought to take a look at this. He will sign it for you, and you can ask the other Tim how he signs the Kindle version, but maybe that happens too. Tim, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Elaine, for that kind introduction. I really am so very, very pleased to be with all of you, many of you good friends, colleagues. Many, many thanks to the organizers, to Phil and Elaine, to Maureen and Brian, to Darren, Eric, Tom, Marianne, and I'm sure more who worked hard to bring today together. So I have long said that my vocation exists in the space in between the academy, the church, and the public square. So I love events like this, to be in the midst of communities of faith who are deep thinking and who are active in the world because of your rootedness in the gospel. So I really am grateful for the invitation to share and to think with you today. As Elaine mentioned, I am a dad, a father of 3. This too is part of my vocation. Almost 2.5 years ago, when our oldest son Henry turned 13, he and I spent 4 days camping together up at Newport State Park on the Door County Peninsula. A kind of father and son coming of age trip. And then again last September, I spent a wonderful weekend with our 13-year-old son, now 14, Frederick, in and around Devil's Lake State Park, again in Wisconsin. And it was one of those stunningly beautiful fall days in the Midwest. For both weekends, in advance of our time together, I invited several important men in Henry and Fred's lives to write letters to them, welcoming them to young adulthood, with whatever guidance they might share. So this is Fred reading those letters over breakfast up in Baraboo, Wisconsin at a diner. And then I found opportunities over the course of the weekend to talk with the boys about sex and drugs and rock and roll and God and baseball, you know, all the important things. You know, this is quite a time in human history to be coming of age. This is quite a time to be a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor of young persons, growing into awareness right now about the world. Now, how many here are parents of young children, youth, grandparents, aunts, uncles? How many here care deeply about the formation of children and youth? Every generation takes up this responsibility to pass on the wisdom gained from the past, to steward and then to hand over what we have learned to be good and true and beautiful. Now, for we Christians, this is the work of traditioning. This is the work of Christian formation and education. Tradition comes from the Latin verb tradere, which means to pass on, to hand over, to deliver, to give. Now, notice this last meaning. Traditioning can also be an act of betrayal. In the gospel narratives, for example, in the passion story of Jesus' betrayal, it is said that Judas, quote, handed over Jesus into the hands of sinners. Tradition is the word. Pontius Pilate is reported to have handed over, traditioned, Jesus to be crucified. So in this work of traditioning, of sharing with the next generation what we have received, what it is that they ought to believe, how they are to live, there is no guarantee that what we are handing over is in fact a gift. In fact, it may very well be a betrayal. And what this means is that we traditioners, and that's everyone here, it means we traditioners must be painstakingly honest about the state of the world we are delivering over to the young, rigorously critical of the beliefs we have received and are passing on, and intentionally discerning about whether the ways of life we are handing over to our children and youth are not, in fact, ways that lead to death. So what is the state of the world we are handing over to the next generation? How is it with the biosphere? As most of you know, the honest answer we are receiving from the scientific community should be setting off all of our generational alarm bells. Stated directly, all of the major biosystems supportive of life as we know it are threatened. Now, at the popular level, this answer is being presented to us in a variety of ways. That we are living amidst a sixth great extinction event. CNN has an online special series called Vanishing, the Sixth Mass Extinction. Warning. Joanna Macy speaks of the Great Unraveling. Jared Diamond of Civilizational Collapse. This is from The Guardian. Language here of climate apocalypse. Now, Elaine introduced you to Audrey, the youngest of our 3 children. When I read about mass extinction and civilizational collapse, I think about humanity in general. And I'm thinking about Audrey and Fred and Henry. Who do you think of? Who comes to mind for you? Whose future well-being do you think of when you consider the state of the world today? Now, my intention is not to manipulate your emotions in framing it that way. But what I would like to do is to invite you to activate your emotions, your deep loves and affections, and a healthy sense of proper caution. Because here's the thing. It is clear that it is not just environmental scientists, but the scientific community as a whole who are quite concerned. And this is traditionally a rather careful bunch, not prone to over-exaggeration or fear-mongering. The World Bank is concerned, as is the insurance industry, as are military analysts and high-ranking officials. Well, what about the church? What about we clergy? What about you laity? Are we clear about the state of the world we are handing over? And if we are, do we understand just what that is going to mean? What kind of work we as Christians have ahead of us? What kind of resources do we in the church have in our scriptures, in our worship practices, in our historical memory, related to sin and guilt and transformation, about how to learn to live differently? I am convinced that we have a wealth of wisdom, theological, practical, communal, institutional, to offer the world at just this point in time. And that's where we're headed, I promise. But first, I want us to go a level deeper. I want us to name and apprehend the problem for ourselves as Christians. So, the biblical story we have received begins with 6 days of creation and a 7th day of rest. Christian belief affirms that the world is the work of God's creation, that every created thing is good, and that altogether the whole is indeed very good. The Hebrew word here is tov. It can be translated as good, as pleasing, but it also means life-furthering or life-generating. As Christian ethicist Cynthia Mo-Labita describes it, what came into being out of nothingness was not merely life. It was more, she said. It was life capable of furthering life in ever more complex and life-generating forms. It was creative and life-creating life. This is the mystery of Tov. And God says it over and over 7 times. God saw that it was good. Tov. So life is generative. Life itself is regenerative. Life traditions. Life hands over to new life. And this alone, this awareness, is cause for sheer celebration. This goodness is reason for exuberant awe at the grand mystery of it all. And we respond here best ultimately in silent reverence, and then with hymns and poems of praise. O Lord, our sovereign, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Well, this then places the problem in proper relief. We are undoing the life-generating goodness given by the Creator and passed on through innumerable forms of life over countless generations. And so I want you, again, to activate, to be in touch with how this makes you feel. This is the wisdom of the mystics, of the contemplatives of our tradition. They teach us that in order to arrive at the energies for new life, we must turn and face into the dark night, the wilderness, the abyss. And so with your loves, your healthy concerns, with your awes close at heart, follow me through a creation story in reverse. The final day of creation, as told in the first Genesis account, is a day of rest. Sabbath, Shabbat, is holy. The whole created earth, every system, every biotic and abiotic form altogether is holy in rest. In the 1970s, chemist James Lovelock introduced what he called the Gaia hypothesis. The idea that the whole of the planet is like an organism, a living body capable of regulating the material conditions necessary for the continuance, sustainment of life. Drawing on this metaphor, we might recognize the innate wisdom that bodies need rest in order to regenerate. So how is the body of the earth faring? Well, we might say the earth is exhausted. Each year, the Global Footprint Network calculates the date we have used as much from nature as the planet can renew over the course of the whole year. The date humanity's demands on nature exceeds what Earth can regenerate in that year. In 2000, Earth Overshoot Day arrived in late September. This last year, it fell on August 8th. The point is not that we start over every January 1st with a replenished biosphere, but just get sick earlier each year. The point is that the ongoing condition of the earth is one of progressively worsening exhaustion. It is unsustainable. Now, note the language used here at the very end of the first account. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. The first creation account conveys that the progressive, we would say evolutionary, transitioning of one generation to the next, again is woven into the very nature of the created order. Life furthers life through generations. On the sixth day of creation, human beings. Now, in just a bit, we'll come back to the question of human vocation. But for now, let's be clear about the overwhelming scientific consensus that the ecological crises we face are anthropogenic. They are caused by human beings. In particular, researchers speak of the Great Acceleration in charting the effect of human activity on the Earth's major life systems, with the last 60 years in particular representing an enormous acceleration of humanity's impact on the natural world. Now, you can't probably read each of the colored lines, but they track things like population, CO2 levels, surface temperature rise, loss of tropical rainforest and woodland, and more. What you can see is the overall upward curve, sometimes called the hockey stick graph, with the 1950s up to the present signaling the most precipitous upward turn. We human beings, the anthropoi, are the most powerful drivers of change in the Earth system. But this is a crucial point. It's very important that we be specific about just who the we are. Because the primary culprits and the chief beneficiaries of the Great Acceleration have not been all human beings in general, but specifically we resource-intensive overconsumers. We here being predominantly Northern, Western European American. We here being predominantly white and wealthy. By the way, I pulled this image from a Forbes magazine article titled All but 3 of America's 185 wealthiest families have one striking thing in common.
White.
Throw it out. They're white.
I thought it was the dog.
So the primary drivers of the Earth's degradation happen to be those least likely to suffer the negative effects. Inversely, or perversely, those least responsible, the world's poor, from so-called underdeveloped nations whose skin colors are darker hued, including in particular indigenous peoples, women, children, the elderly. Those least responsible have been those suffering the worst effects. This is an image taken from an article about the worsening climate refugee crisis. And so we must speak here not just about environmental degradation in general or unsustainability. We must speak specifically about ecological justice, of environmental racism, of ecological debt. Day 5. Before the creation of human beings in the Genesis account, God creates all other earth creatures. Then the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. As the great ecologist Aldo Leopold recognized so clearly, the well-being of any one member of a species within a habitat is dependent upon the health of the whole. This is the basis for his famous land ethic. The UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment reports that, quote, the structure and function of the world's ecosystems changed more rapidly in the second half of the 20th century than at any time in human history, resulting in a substantial and largely irreversible loss in the diversity of life on Earth. The World Wildlife Fund released a study signaling that the number of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish across the globe is on average about half the size it was just 40 years ago. Biologist Norman Myers describes the rapid collapsing of global biodiversity as a, quote, human-caused biotic holocaust, with the major causes being loss of habitat, overhunting, overfishing, climate change, and toxic pollution. Day 4. The fourth day, we might say, points to the stable ordering of the creation, with the rhythms of day and night and 4 consistent seasons of summer, fall, winter, and spring. Although the fluctuation of nature's rhythms have always been relatively unpredictable, still there has, for the most part, been a macro-level stability over the last 10,000 years, with consistent average temperature ranges and consistent patterns over time. These are the rhythms that human beings have marked with seasonal celebrations and relied upon to grow food, the same rhythms wildlife have followed for migrational patterns or hibernation patterns. Several years ago, Hunter Lovins proposed that we replace the word or the phrase global warming with global weirding to communicate the reality that the result of a warming biosphere is not just a rise in average global temperatures, but an amplification of the abnormal. More frequent and more severe superstorms, an increase in massive droughts and major flooding events, lightning strikes, wildfires, mudslides, a significant changing rhythm to the seasons. This is impacting everything from the earlier blooming of flowers and trees, coupled with a disrupted timing of birds, bees, and butterflies for feeding and pollinating, to an ongoing northward shifting of tree species, some at an astonishing rate each year further north. We human beings are being affected as well. Philosopher Glenn Albrecht has suggested the term solastalgia, a combination of a Latin word meaning comfort and a Greek word meaning pain or longing. Solastalgia, he proposed, is the pain experienced when there is recognition that the place where one resides and that one loves is under assault. Day 3. The separation of the dry land from the seas and the emergence of vegetation, of trees in particular. Scientifically, we know that the two most important biomes in the biosphere are the oceans and the forests. A biome is a large community of flora, fauna, and diverse ecosystems that make up a major habitat. Forests are the dominant land ecosystem on Earth, accounting for about 75% of the gross primary productivity of biosphere. Forests are a primary contributor to the production of oxygen. They serve as one of the largest carbon sinks on the planet. They regulate temperatures. They provide food, oils, resins, spices, and so much more. We simply could not live without forests. And yet, half of the forests that once covered the earth are now gone. Most of the destruction has taken place again over the last century and a half, with the last 50 years representing, once again, an accelerated pace. The state of our oceans are similarly dire. Here we can name the growing number and size of garbage patches in our oceans, the increasing problem of oceanic dead zones caused by agricultural runoff, the rapid depletion of marine life through overfishing, and the loss of the ocean's coral reefs. Famed oceanographer Sylvia Earle, who has spent her life researching and advocating for the ocean, has mournfully written, quote, "The oceans are dying." If you haven't seen the 2014 documentary called Mission Blue, I would recommend it to you. The second day, the separation of earth from sky through what earlier translations called the firmament, an expanse, a canopy, what this translation calls a dome, and what we today call the atmosphere. The atmosphere being a layer of gases, the air that surrounds the planet, protecting life by absorbing solar radiation, warming the surface through heat retention, and then reducing temperature extremes between day and night. And this, of course, brings us to climate change, or global warming, what's called the greenhouse effect. The trapping of radiation under a thickening blanket that would have otherwise returned out into space. In his book, Earth, spelled E-A-A-R-T-H, United Methodist layperson Bill McKibben argues that we no longer live on the same planet that for the last 10,000 years has supported the rise of human civilization. For that whole period of time, he says, the temperature barely budged, averaging somewhere between 58 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit worldwide. But we no longer live on that planet, McKibben writes. The world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God separated the light from darkness the first day. And so we arrive in reverse to the first day of creation, to the beginning, when all was a formless void, the nihil, the nothingness, out of which, creatio ex nihilo, God creates. So I asked you to activate your emotions, to associate with your loves, your affections, as we journeyed through this creation story in reverse. In his still important book on prophetic imagination, Walter Brueggemann teaches that pain, lament, mourning can be a necessary predecessor to hope. That lament is the spiritual source of genuine prophetic action. He writes, "It is precisely those who know death most painfully who can speak hope most vigorously." I would affirm for you and with you that if this generation is going to pass on a hopeful future to generations yet unborn, we are going to have to turn and face directly into these very painful realities. And so I want us to spend just a few minutes, we need more time, but just a few minutes thinking about these two questions. In what ways are you already experiencing in your own life the great uncreation? Where are you seeing signs around you of this unraveling? And then, most importantly, what feelings emerge for you when you turn to face the earth's pain? So let me give you just like 5 minutes to turn, share with one or two others next to you in response to these two questions. Go ahead, I'll pull us back together.
I was thinking about invasive species. Likely that this climate change, human activities, I guess. Beetles from Asia now taking root. Well, there's definitely concerted effort by, I think about part of the discussion has to be corporate capitalism. It has to be whatever capitalism was 200 years ago, what it is now, concentrates power, and part of that concentrated power is power to control the state. And so if we're really only doing hope, this idea that, consumer choice. I mean, why are billions and billions of dollars? Because by reminding us of people who control the narrative, it creates a kind of fantasy challenge. unfortunately, a lot of these problems won't be solved without being structured. Human beings, parents, and our chapters of our history, most recently, when you think about the fight against fascism, Europe, and Holocaust. Those are stark choices, but I don't think this is a stark choice. None of this, whether people believe it or not.
Somebody's also on.
There's definitely a
So I'm going to pull us back. Apologies, we don't have more time.
I guess I'm just saying it's going to be political.
Briefly, without expanding, just one or two word response to the second question. What feelings emerged? What did you hear? What did you express? Sadness.
Deep despair.
Despair. Guilt, anger. Unrest. Weirdness.
A longing for what was.
Longing. Yeah.
Motivation for change.
Motivation. Yeah. So that part of the presentation is always so hard because I'm not, to a group like this, I'm not introducing entirely new information. But I am reminding us of what we know and perhaps deepening it for some. It's hard. It's hard. But I really do believe that in response to one of the questions that came up this morning, why is this issue particularly so difficult? One answer might be that if this is all true, if we're going to let that in and accept it as true, that's really difficult to come to terms with. And so perhaps it's easier to just keep it out here. So this work of attending to our emotions, our affective response, I think is not the only, but I think it's one of the key ways to motivate, to get us to that point where we start to act and don't feel paralyzed. So let's turn there. Pope Francis is calling for a global ecological conversion. Thomas Berry has argued that the great work of our time is to integrate all human activities into the rhythms and the needs of the biosphere. Wow. What a time in human history to be alive. What a time to be a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a pastor, a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, an architect, a farmer, a caregiver, an artist, a chef. What a time to be a young person coming of age at just this point in time. One of my mentors, Sally McFaig, says that this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. We're needing each of the gifts from every discipline, every tradition, every insight that we can muster, all working together toward the healing of our planetary home. Well, I want to turn now to examine, to deepen, and to continue to engage, as we did already this morning, around some basic Christian beliefs, with the aim of identifying how certain received theological understandings might have contributed to this great uncreation, but also how reformed or perhaps more faithful understandings might contribute in the great conversion ahead. Now you may be wondering, Christian doctrine? It's an all-hands-on-deck moment and we're talking about Christian doctrine? Well, first of all, I am a Christian theologian, so that's going to be part of my contribution. But I think there's more to it than just that. Back in 1966, medieval historian Lynn White wrote a very influential essay called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, in which he argued that the problem of the exploitation of nature, particularly in the West, has its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, he also suggested at the end of the essay that the answer will necessarily need to be religious as well. And interestingly enough, he closed by pointing to Francis of Assisi as the patron saint of ecology. Any of you read that essay? No. So those of us presently stewarding the Christian tradition are responsible for interrogating it, asking what the fruits of certain beliefs have been, and then asking ourselves what it is that we will choose to teach, what it is that we will pass on to the next generation. Are our basic beliefs good news for the earth? So let's start with creation. One of the key scriptural passages, as you know, here is from the first passage of Genesis. The key word here being dominion. Practically speaking, how have we in the modern industrial West interpreted that command to have dominion?
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want.
Exploit.
Say that again.
Exploit.
Exploit.
Exploitation.
It's ours for the taking.
Ours for the taking. Freedom to do with the earth as we please. Freedom here being a license to dominate. This was at the root of White's argument, by the way, that understanding dominion as domination directly contributed to landscapes like this mountaintop removal site near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Now, as many biblical scholars have noted, the Hebrew word for dominion, radah, is also used to describe the righteous king, one who cares for the people, who judges rightly, who ensures the well-being of the land, and whose particular concern is for the poor. Now, for Christians, we who read the Hebrew Scriptures through the lens of the New Testament, Jesus, ultimately, is the final standard for true dominionship. And to have dominion in the way of Jesus, the righteous King, is not to control or manipulate or to dominate for selfish ends, but to care for. Jesus' lordship brings life to others. It's something more like a gardener. Remember John's account of Jesus' resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene. She mistakes him, right, for the gardener. So Jesus here we affirm is the one who tends, who nurtures with the Spirit to bring forth life, fruitfulness. That's a true understanding of dominion. A related teaching concerns how we've interpreted the Imago Dei, the image of God. The Imago Dei, throughout much of the Christian tradition, is interpreted as something immaterial. It's the capacity for self-reflexivity, or it's our freedom to choose, or it's our capacity to will one thing over another. Now, from an ecological perspective, there are at least two potential concerns here. One is that by having so emphasized human forms of intelligence, we have entirely missed the myriad other ways other members of the creation are not only intelligent, but differently intelligent in astonishingly complex ways. This is a concern about anthropocentrism, about regarding human beings not just as the pinnacle of creation, at the center, but as the sole lens through which to understand and value all other life forms. A second concern here is that by locating the Imago Dei within that which is immaterial, Christian teaching has directly and indirectly denigrated the body, the earth, material life. But a disembodied understanding of the human being is really quite foreign to a biblical worldview. Here from the second creation account in Genesis. The Lord God formed Adam from the dust of Adamah. Adamah here being Hebrew for earth, dust, soil, clay, land, country. We are earth creatures, creatures of the land, earthlings. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer affirmed, and God blew into the human being's nostrils the breath of life. Here, body and life merge completely. To live as a human being means to live as a body in the Spirit. The body is the form in which the Spirit exists, and the Spirit is the form in which the body exists. The Hebrew name for Eve is Echwa, which means to live. Eve means living one, source of life. Echwa, the mother of life. So who are we? We are earth creatures, formed by God and rooted in a garden of delight. That's what the word Eden means, delight. And that is the original and the enduring divine intention for we humans. Humanum, derived from the same root as humus, earth, ground. God's intention is for we earth creatures to thrive, to be whole as whole persons. Now, to return to the first account, in the image of God, He created them. Male and female, God created them. We can say further that we were created to be in relationship. We are who we are only in and through relationships. So Bonhoeffer wrote of the imago relationis, or Barth of the imago trinitatis. We are created in the image of the divine communion, relationships. We are members of the community of creation, not apart from, but an integral part. This is an ecological understanding, and I would argue it is a deeply biblical affirmation as well. Now, imagine with me, what if we were to identify this as the chief sense of vocation that we instilled in our children, or in all Christians? What if beyond the particular vocational gifts and paths that we helped our children and youth and young adults identify, what if this were the common vocation we claimed and nurtured in us all? To be earth keepers, to tend, to give life to love as members with this community of creation. We'll come back to this. So, sin and salvation. Three of the most basic questions in Christian theology are related to the doctrine of salvation. From what do we need to be saved? For what are we saved? And who shall save us? Now, for much of the Christian tradition, especially in Western Christianity, the answers to these questions have been deeply shaped by the worldview of ancient Greece, by Platonism and Neoplatonism. Simply stated, in this world, the earth, the body, matter reflect the fallen world. Salvation, then, is escaping the body. It is fleeing to an immaterial world, to be with God, who is pure being. In this life, then, it is the things of the body which tempt us to turn away from God. It is the things of the earth which lead us astray. And this saturates our pieties, our hymnody, right? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full into his wonderful face. And the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the glory of his light and grace. When I die, glory, glory, by and by, I'll fly away. Salvation is to be released from the body, from the earth. So why ultimately care about climate change if this world has no enduring eternal significance? If our bodies and the body of the earth are to be discarded in the end, I mean, what really is the problem with honeybee colony collapse disorder? We hear these responses, right, Katie, in our churches. Karl Barth wrote, "Perhaps nowhere else has Christianity fallen further than precisely in this estimation of the relation between spirit and matter, inner and outer. Redemption is not the separation of spirit from matter. It is not that humanity goes to heaven, but rather that God's kingdom comes to us in matter and on earth." And how again does God come to us? In whom is the kingdom in flesh? The heart of the Christian faith is the belief that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And to believe that Jesus is God with us in the flesh is to affirm that God does indeed love the world. This means rejecting, not embracing, a dualistic view of body and soul. And it means taking seriously the importance of bodily healing in Jesus' ministry. Now, these are some of the earliest depictions of Jesus. In fact, for the first 1,000 years of Christian existence, we see very few images of the cross. We see predominantly images of a shepherd caring for a flock, surrounded by images of paradise, which are images of the earth. Jesus bringing salvation here to the earth. Skip over a Sally McFaith quote. For we United Methodists, let me suggest that this more holistic understanding of salvation, that salvation is about health, healing, restoration of the whole person in all of his or her relationships. This was at the heart of Wesley's life and teaching and ministry. Wesley scholar Randy Maddox has written that Wesley's understanding of salvation was that it's not just a future thing, but a present reality as well. It's not just intellectual assent to certain propositions, but trust in one's heart, one's whole being, one's affections as well. Not just the forgiveness of sins, but the transformation of one's entire life. Not just salvation for individuals, but also for society, and not just for souls, but for bodies. In fact, Wesley placed great emphasis upon physical health and healing as a matter of salvation. It's likely that one of his most widely read publications was a little pamphlet called Primitive Physic. Have you heard of Primitive Physic? A few nodding your heads. It's a collection of home remedies based on common fruits, herbs, and plants that, especially for the sake of the poor, could be grown in one's backyard or in a window planter. You know, when I was first introduced to Primitive Physic in seminary, usually the professors would mention it kind of embarrassingly. Crazy Uncle John recommending a twist of lemon for an earache. But I've come to think of Grandpa John as more of something of a pioneer in alternative, or what we would today call holistic health. Medicine right out of your garden. Well, imagine if all United Methodist clergy were trained in organic gardening techniques in seminary and herbal medicine to promote holy or healthy living among we Methodists as a matter of salvation. Imagine that. Now, holistic for Wesley in the sense of all-encompassing, but also because for Wesley, salvation is about relationality, about loving relationship in the whole of life. Now, you may remember the minor controversy that arose a couple years ago when it was alleged that Pope Francis had told a young boy that he would see his dog, who had recently died, in heaven. Pet lovers and animal rights groups around the world rejoiced. But it appears he didn't actually say this, so the follow-up headlines led with, "Sorry, fighter." Well, Wesley is far less ambiguous. For him, it is clear, animals will share with us in the new creation. He writes, the whole brute creation will then undoubtedly be restored. They shall enjoy happiness suited to their state, without interruption and without end. Related to this, Wesley, somewhat unusual for his era, advocated for the compassionate treatment of animals. In a journal entry, he includes at length an anonymous letter he had received, and he offers it as a perspective he very much approves of. I would ask if nature, reason, and revelation do not all plead in favor even of the animal creation. Can reason consent to making sport with the life or misery of any creature? May not the great law of equity be extended even to them? May we not suppose ourselves in their place and thence determine what they may fairly expect from us? A golden rule in relationship to the non-human animal world. Today we would call this seeing with a non-anthropocentric perspective, and its implications are wide-ranging. So salvation from a Wesleyan perspective entails a growing into and going on to perfection in our enfleshed, bodily, material love of God, others, and the whole of creation, including animals. So this is still the most important question for we Methodists. Are we going on to holiness in the whole of life? Well, if this is what we mean by salvation, what are we to say of sin? Katie mentioned this morning, so let me just briefly turn to a quote from the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, who writes, "How we treat the earth and all of creation defines the relationship that each of us has with God. To commit a crime against the natural world is a sin. For humans to cause species to become extinct and to destroy the diversity of God's creation, these things are sins." Even more, we need to make clear that human sins against the earth are intimately related to sins against human beings. To give just one example here, that of environmental racism. Study after study show that the two most predictive indicators of where you will find toxic waste dumping in the United States are race first and class or poverty second. The consequences are stark, from cancer rates to asthma to lead pollution in homes and pipes and more. To speak in the logic of our Christian faith, we need to call these forms of crucifixion. These are the crucifixions of people and places. So where will our help come from? Who shall save us from this body of death? The issue of our time, I would argue, may not ultimately be climate change or biodiversity collapse themselves, but at the most basic level of whether we can access resources of hope, energies of resistance, and powers for life. Because we know that despair leads to apathy, and apathy leads to inaction. So we need to see hope as our most important source of renewable energy. sake of time, let me move forward and affirm that for we Christians, our hope is ultimately centered in the resurrection. In the coming, as Katie affirmed, of a new creation of heaven and a new earth. To affirm the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting is a radical faith conviction with wide-ranging ecological implications. We'll skip over a quote from Elizabeth Johnson, a feminist Catholic eco-theologian. Another by N.T. Wright. Let me say here that what I'm offering this morning is a condensed version. You probably feel the fast pace, apologies for that, of a much larger 2.5, 3-hour presentation. Those are recorded. If you're interested in them and the longer view, my information is back there and I can send those to you. So let's turn finally to hope in action. What is to be done? Let me start with personal holiness. If you are not already, I would encourage you to begin at the most intimate personal level, or nurturing in others the love of a particular place. A flower garden, an indoor pot, a neighborhood park, a particular spot on a certain shoreline. You might make this a contemplative prayer practice. Pay close attention to how this plant lives, how that place shifts with the season. Ask, what are the signs of degradation here? What are the causes of the diminishment of life here? And then how can I participate in its flourishing? How might I be an earth keeper to this particular place or life form? Now, for me personally, this place, one of many, is in our side yard in Evanston. When we first moved into our home 7 years ago, the side lot had been degraded significantly with heavy doses of chemicals, fertilizer, and when I tested the soil when we first moved, the soil was dead. And it was a lifeless environment. No pollinators, no butterflies, birds weren't coming in the spring to pluck earthworms from the soil. And so I set about seeking to regenerate that side lot. I've been trained in permaculture design, which is a holistic design method, a regenerative ecological practice. And we began to participate with this landscape, and it's coming back to life. And this summer, sitting in the backyard, watching the monarchs and the pollinators and the endless birds, the life just buzzing and humming from that side yard was profoundly meaningful and regenerative and regrounding for my own spirit, my own energies for hope. So one place to begin, to put hope into action, find a place, small, medium-sized, wherever you are, and participate in its regeneration. Home economics, or household holiness. A recent study estimated that environmental pressures arising from households contribute more than 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, I think most of you know you can find any number of carbon footprint calculators online to assess your footprint, your current impact. I'm not going to review these in any detail because I think most of us know what to do. The matter is following through. And here I might suggest the Wesleyan logics of small group accountability. How might we watch over one another in love and the earth in love by encouraging each other to bring about regeneration through our household practices? So be a regenerating homekeeper. How about at the congregational level? We've already heard about green teams. How many of you are a member of a green team? How many of you are at churches that have green teams? Even a few more hands go up. Let me skip over some advice there and direct you, if you're not familiar with Green Faith, greenfaith.org. And here I'm quoting from their mission statement. It is an interfaith coalition that works with houses of worship, religious schools, and people of all faiths to help them become better environmental stewards. In particular, Green Faith has a 2-year certificate program with active ongoing coaching to help walk a congregation through all aspects of greening their congregation and their community. Our congregation in Evanston, First UMC Evanston, will be starting the certification process this year. Perhaps some of you may take up and join us in that work. Now, in terms of resources for Sunday school classes or small groups, well, even like 10 years ago, that was maybe a more difficult question to answer. But there are just an abundance, including a new wonderful resource by an amazing author named Katie Dawson to be reading in small groups in our churches. We've heard about our social principles. Our book of resolutions has a host of statements on stewardship, environmental justice, energy, water, and more. We've heard about the bishop's pastoral letter and initiative. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the United Methodist Women and their focus this last year on climate justice. Quick side note, let me just say thank God for the United Methodist Women. Amen. We have been on the forefront of this and so many other urgent matters of social justice worldwide for decades. It's time for the rest of us to join them in the work that they are doing. Now, if you've made it through these resources and you want to go further, please, if you haven't yet read Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, you really need to. Read it at home, read it with a small group at church, read it with friends, colleagues. Please read it. I could go on and on more resources. If you go to garrett.edu/sustaingets, you'll see a page with information about what we're doing in the seminary, but there's a tab called Resources. And I've got a suggested bibliography. There are far more resources one could delve into, but that's kind of my recommended starter list. You can also always feel free to email me and say, looking for something in this area, that, I just read this, what would you suggest next? And I'd be happy to consult with you. And to learn from you with what you're learning and reading. Regional holiness. Ched Myers is now speaking about watershed discipleship, about attending to our local watersheds in the same way that we care for the souls of the members of our congregation, and if we're doing ministry well, our neighborhoods and communities. How might we attend to and care for our local watersheds? I've written on bioregional discipleship. So, what might we do in thinking about discipleship at the level of our annual conferences, or even at the jurisdictional level? I'm thrilled about the Creation Care Alliance here in Indiana. Minnesota Annual Conference has a very active group called Hopeful Earth Keepers. The Northern Illinois Conference now has a very active Bishop's Task Force on Sustainability. I should know it since I served on it. What might happen if Minnesota and Indiana and Northern Illinois and Wisconsin, other annual conference groups began to conspire and dream and work together about a regenerative vision for the Midwest. How might we bring gatherings like this together and share ideas and resources and energy and hope? Because one of the beautiful things about getting to do the work that I do and that Tim does, and I think Katie's going to be doing more and more of, is I'm in conversations like this with congregations and church groups all around this region. There is a growing recognition of the urgency and a growing motivation to get to work. Let's start to collaborate. Let's start to attend to our bioregion together. Turning outward toward denominational holiness. Just this past fall, a new denominational center for mission innovation launched a United Methodist Earth Keepers program. Have you heard of the Earth Keepers program? A few of you, right? Katie, did you go to the...
No, I'm like local ministry, so.
Okay.
I'm learning all that.
So the intention of the Earth Keepers program, this denominational missional program, is to train and equip over the next several years up to 500 United Methodist Earth Keepers, commissioned by the church, whether clergy, laity, whatnot, to care for, to regenerate, to seek justice for the earth in their particular locations, and to provide training and systems of accountability and support in that work. So if you are at all committed to these issues and want to be connected with your broader brothers and sisters in our denomination, I would encourage you to think about Earth Keepers. There was a gathering in February in D.C. The next gathering is in Minnesota in 2 weeks. I'll be speaking there. They're still taking applications, so if you're inspired and you're free, come on up to Minnesota and engage. Let me just say it is well past time for Christian churches to divest from fossil fuels. And it's well past time that we United Methodists do so. Probably the best mechanism of doing so is getting organized, and fossil-free UMC, I would say, is the best mechanism to do so. So let's say you're the chair of your local church green team. You're currently leading a series on Laudato Si. You've been commissioned as a UMC Earth Keeper, and you still want to go deeper. Well, I know just the place. The Methodist Theological School in Ohio, right, Tim? And Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. We have a new, starting in 2018, a new suite of ecological justice courses that students in the MDiv, MTS, DMin, a new MA in public ministry, and we'll be working for lay certification we'll have access to. Finally, let's talk about socio-political holiness, and then I'll close. Earth-keeping hope and action, oriented toward a new creation, must be public. A missional church must be a public church committed to the flourishing of the common good. Historically, faith communities, as you know, have been at the heart of so many of the great movements for social justice. The abolition of slavery, fair labor laws, civil rights, women's equality, disarmament, to name a few. To be honest, in recent decades, I think those of us in the mainline traditions have grown a bit complacent.
Amen.
Maybe we've assumed that history would just simply progress on its own without struggle toward greater inclusion, justice, and peace. Maybe we thought we had done our work. Well, I think it's abundantly clear that the times are calling for us to recover something of a earlier, more feisty spirit. Let me briefly suggest 3 ways, and then I'll close. And I'm adapting these from Richard Heinberg, the Post-Carbon Institute. First, the times call for faithful Christian resistance. This is an image of clergy in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, who were arrested for blocking a controversial pipeline construction. Any of you travel out to Standing Rock last fall? Took a group of students out there, one of the more profound experiences of my life. Wherever the good creation is threatened, radical Christian earthkeepers are called to show up and to protect and to resist. Second, the times call for faithful Christian resilience. Many of the most promising developments, and I heard some of them this morning, in the environmental movement are occurring at the municipal level. And I would say, in light of our current federal situation, municipalities are where we also need to be actively putting our energies. Anything from climate action plans, to urban farming, to green building codes, to green mortgages, to habitat restoration, to community-owned renewable energy projects. We should be sending our children, our youth, our adult VIM teams, our missioner groups to do this kind of work. Faithful Christian resilience building. Finally, the times call for faithful Christian reformation. This is the work of broad-scale systemic change. Political advocacy, voter drives, letter campaigns, running for office, party platform building, joining and supporting environmental groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network. I'm a big fan of the Next System project, precisely because it thinks in terms of overlapping systems of class, race, environment, recognizing that to attend any of them means we must attend to all systemically. The point is, global ecological conversion big enough to bring about global biospheric regeneration is going to take massive grassroots organization, broad-scale institutional commitment, and systemic political economic change over generations. Well, how are we going to do that? Where are we going to find the resources to stick with that kind of work? Let me close with this quote from Gus Speth, co-chair of the Next System project. He writes, "I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." We do. We do. We need to remember that we do, and we need to get to work. So let's do it. Thanks.